Hi, my name is Steve Copeland and welcome to this three-part video series on the Nephilim. In this video, I want to answer the most common objection regarding the Nephilim, namely the claim that it is impossible for angels and women to procreate. This claim stands on the passage where Jesus said that humans will not marry in heaven, but be like the angels. This is Matthew 22 and verse 30. The second claim is that angels have no physical form. In this video, we will answer these objections and in subsequent videos discuss the evidence for the giants and their bloodlines from Scripture, their demonic plan to stop the prophecy of Genesis 3:15, and later the global evidence for their existence. Genesis 6:1-4 states that the sons of God, that is the B'nai Elohim in Hebrew, saw the daughters of men were beautiful and chose whomever they would as wives for themselves. This is a literal translation of the Hebrew. Verse 6 tells us more, saying that the sons of God and daughters of men produce children. The term sons of God, B'nai Elohim, is used to speak of angels, not human beings, as in Job 1:6 and other verses in Job, where Satan is mentioned as one of these angels. Also, the word Nephilim in the Greek version of the Old Testament, that is the Septuagint or LXX, the word Nephilim is simply translated as gigantos or giants. The Septuagint version is the only version that the apostles quote from in the entire New Testament. If we are going to take the clearest statements of Genesis 6, whoever we believe the sons of God are, they had sexual relations with women and produced the Nephilim, the giants. The very fact that the text distinguishes between sons of God and daughters of men does not fit the theory that Scripture is speaking of Seth. This is one of Adam's sons, as Julian the Apostate claimed in the 4th century AD. For Seth was the son of a man, namely Adam, but more of that in a later video. The letters of Jude and 2 Corinthians are the epistles which give us the answer to how angels were able to procreate with human women. In Jude verses 4-6, the apostle speaks of certain men who have secretly slipped in among them, godless men who change the grace of God into a license for immorality and deny Jesus Christ as our only sovereign and Lord. Jude's two concerns in his letter are using grace as a license for immorality and denial of Christ's sovereignty or lordship. It's very important that we understand the context of what we're reading. Verses 6-8 are tied together by the words in a similar way and in the same way. Verse 7 begins with the words in the same way, and verse 8 in the very same way. Now, if we analyze the meaning of verses 7-8, then we're going to know what Jude is referring to in verse 6, because this is the subject of this same way. Verse 8 summarizes these first verses. In the very same way, these dreamers pollute their bodies, reject authority, and slander celestial beings. Here, the two issues are addressed in the conclusion: sexual immorality and the rejection of authority. However, please note the reference to angels, for as we shall see, angels feature in at least two of Jude's other examples. Therefore, they are a central theme in the apostle's mind. As we move backwards, we have the account of Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns. Now, the NIV translates their sins as sexual immorality and perversion. This is a poor translation, as it doesn't bring out Jude's point about going after strange flesh. The New American Standard translates as gross immorality and going after strange flesh. This is actually a literal translation from the Greek. Most commentators believe that Jude is referring firstly to their homosexuality, this is the men of Sodom and Gomorrah, and their desire to have sex with the angels who were with Lot, a passage we will examine in more detail. But before going to verse 6, please notice that verse 7 begins in the NIV with the words "in a similar way." Now, there is no doubt that the verses which follow verse 6 are speaking of gross sexual immorality. If we are to take Jude's words in a similar way and then speak of gross immorality and going after strange flesh, then we must read verse 7 in that context. But the Greek is even more emphatic. The words "in the same manner" do not occur at the beginning of verse 7, but exactly before the words fornication and strange flesh. Jude emphatically ties the sin of the angels to committing fornication and going after strange flesh. So now to verse 6. Two sins are expressed: not remaining under God's authority and rule, and deserting their own abode. Now, this is the Greek word oikaterion. This word is translated as habitation or abode, and in the NIV, own home. Now, good exegesis studies every use of a word to find its meaning in Scripture and in context. So now we need to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1, and it reads as follows: "For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, but eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven." Now notice, please, that we have several other words for tent, house, or building here. And also notice, please, that he says that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed. All of these words are speaking of the habitation of our soul or spirit, not about a place we live physically, but the body we will have when we have this new body, which is from heaven, because human flesh cannot enter heaven. And when the apostle speaks of the transition from one body to another, he uses this word oikaterion. Paul is speaking of our bodies here, not about a place where our bodies will be in a physical sense, as the next verses testify. He makes these exact same arguments in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 35 to 56. The soul, or essence of the person, is housed temporarily in this earthly tent, but it will be transformed into this special habitation, a heavenly body. Now, we have no other passages of Scripture in order to compare this word. So why does Paul use this word? Simply because the transformation of an earthly body into a heavenly body is a unique experience to Christians and no others. So why is Jude using this word when speaking of angels? Well, he contrasts the sins of the men of Sodom and Gomorrah with the sins of the angels who are being kept in chains awaiting judgment. You will find this also in 2 Peter 2:4. The Sodomite sin was to indulge in sexual immorality and to go after strange flesh. Strange flesh is the literal translation from Greek, and it means to go after a kind of flesh which is not the same as your own. In the case of the men of Sodom, they were living in sexual immorality, specifically homosexuality, and when they saw the angels who had the form of men, they ordered Lot to hand them over so that they could rape them. We know they wanted to rape them because the angels refused to go to them, in fact ended up blinding them. The angels were not human beings, they were strange flesh. These men of Sodom rejected Lot's daughters who were of the same flesh and demanded the strange flesh of the angels. Such was the depth of their depravity. In the same way, the angels abandoned their angelic bodies, this is Jude 6, and went after strange flesh, that is, the flesh of human women. Now, just as we will be transformed into new heavenly and immortal bodies, a new habitation of our souls, these angels abandoned their bodies and God's authority and took on bodies which could procreate with human women. This is the clear teaching of Jude, and his use of oikaterion is his explanation of how this transformation occurred. And when we go back to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 2, it strongly suggests that the angels' primary motivation was lust, that they saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took of them any they would choose. The word took in Hebrew can have many meanings throughout Scripture, including to seize, to take by force, to lay a hold of, and also to marry. However, the words took whomever they chose strongly suggest that at least some of these women were taken by force. Jude's tying this event to Sodom with the words "in the same way," and the fact that the Sodomites desired to rape the angels, adds strength to the argument. Now in Jude verses 14 to 15, the apostle quotes the book of Enoch. This fact is disturbing for many scholars, but the truth is that Enoch was considered to be inspired by many in the early church, at least in part. Enoch gives some very specific details about the topic we are discussing, and gives other insights which are also important. Consider this quote from chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. "And it came to pass that when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to this deed, and I alone will have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swore they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon." This is from the Apocrypha, translated by R.H. Charles. Now, for your information, Jared is the 5th generation from Adam, which gives you the time when this event occurred. This is in Genesis chapter 5 and verse 15. Now, what is obvious from Enoch's account are the following. 1. That Enoch confirms that these angels lusted after human woman and desired to procreate. 2. That they knew this deed was a great sin and would have consequences. 3. That 200 of them swore an oath together to go through with this plan. And 4. That they descended onto the summit of Mount Hermon where this transformation took place. Why is Mount Hermon important here? Is it just a coincidence that Jesus ascended to Mount Hermon where he was transfigured before Peter and John? Now, the word used for transformation comes from the root meaning a metamorphosis, a changing from one body to another. Jesus' human body was transformed into the likeness of his pre-incarnate body, the body he had before he took on human flesh. The purpose of this was for the disciples to see with their own eyes who he really was, and to hear the Father's voice say, This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. This is Matthew 17:5, and this verse is in the imperative, an emphatic command. Mount Hermon is the place where the 200 angels descended to undergo their metamorphosis, to change their bodies in order to carry out their plan, a plan which rejected God's authority over them, because they knew this was a great sin, and led humanity into utter wickedness, a depth of evil which brought about the global flood. Jesus took his disciples to the very same place and showed them who he is. The one who came to destroy the devil's work by taking on human flesh was made for a little while lower than the angels, and to free humanity from death caused by sin, caused by rejecting God's authority. This is Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 to 18. So why is this topic of the Nephilim, or giants, so important? Atheists often point to the destruction of women and children under the command of Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. Why did God command such a thing? You know, there are only 2 times in all of human history where the Lord destroyed, or commanded to be destroyed, everything that had breath. The first was the global flood, and the second in the conquest of Canaan. In both of these cases, the Nephilim were involved. The Nephilim's influence in Genesis 6 was so powerful that God said that every thought of man was only evil all of the time. And in Canaan, these people were under the same influence, sacrificing live children and even breeding children for this very purpose. Secondly, we need to understand that the very first prophecy given in Genesis 3 about a child who would crush the serpent's head, meaning destroy Satan's authority over death and mortality. This was a spiritual battle. God destroyed that global influence with the great flood, but the Nephilim returned because Genesis 6:4 says they were on the earth in those days, meaning the days of the flood, and also afterward, meaning after the flood. We have biblical evidence for their origins after the flood as well, but the important thing to realize is that they congregated mostly in one particular place, the land of Canaan, the land promised to Abraham, from whom the child, the Messiah, would come, the child who would crush Satan's head. The Nephilim fortified the cities of Canaan, and when Moses sent the spies, the people heard the report of the giants in the land, the Nephilim, and they refused to trust the Lord. I want to suggest that Satan knew God's prophecy to Abraham that his descendants would spend 400 years in slavery and then be brought to the promised land. This is Genesis 15. And that through him all nations would be blessed. Satan used that 400 years to prepare. His plan was to destroy the Jewish people and stop the child who would crush his head, his authority. There are about 45 references to giants in Scripture. In the next video, we will explore their bloodlines and ancestry, the practice of those who lived under their influence, and the tribes which interbred with them. In the third video, we will look at the vast amount of evidence for giants in ancient cultures, discuss the religions they initiated, and some of the mysteries of the ancient world. If you are interested in how the Nephilim feature in almost every ancient culture of the world and are mentioned in the Vedas, the Gathas, the Avestas, and other ancient texts, you will find this in my textbook, Religion, History, and Mystery. Please remember to like and subscribe and share this video with those who may benefit from hearing it, and also I look forward to your comments below. God bless.